In recent years, we've seen a surge in migration levels, not just in the UK, but across advanced economies. And since Brexit, there's also been a change in the composition of migration, with The Economist reporting unskilled migrants went from 11% of permits in 2021 to 62% in 2023. Now, many newspapers highlighted a report by the OBR which stated that low-skilled migrants are a net negative impact on public finances. Now, they're referring to this analysis which suggests low-skilled migrant workers have a negative net impact on tax revenue. Now, this analysis by the OBR includes government spending necessary to maintain a constant public sector capital stock person, because one criticism of the past 15 years is that higher levels of a population, mostly due to migration, hasn't led to a corresponding increase in public services like schools and doctor surgeries. If you have more people, you need to build more services and improve transport. But these newspaper headlines are still misleading, because firstly, the average migrant worker wage contributes more than the average UK resident. Focusing only on low-wage migrants is only part of the story. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this analysis assumes that the migrant stays until they die. However, this is usually not the case. At least 60% of migrant workers leave within 4 years, and this is especially the case with work and study visas. 80% of study and work visas have expired within 5 years. The big exception is those who come on family visas. This tends to be for a lifetime. Now, what has changed in the past 2 years is that we've seen a large rise in the number of dependents, people coming not for work or study purposes, but related to other people who are. And this will have a different fiscal impact to those who come only to study or to work. Now, to understand the fiscal impact of migration, it's useful to look at how age affects fiscal transfers. So people under 20 are a net fiscal cost to the state because they have expensive education and child benefit. People of working age are paying a lot of tax and not getting too much back in the form of benefits. It's only when people retire that they become net recipients again, mainly in the form of pensions and, towards the end of their life, healthcare. So clearly a migrant worker who came at the age of 20 and left age 65 would make a large fiscal contribution, even if they were relatively low paid. So the fiscal impact of migration depends on a few factors. Firstly, their average salary, but also the number of dependents, the amount of remittances that they send back to their country of origin, and how long they stay. So we can't definitively say the fiscal cost of a migrant without knowing these factors. Now, there is evidence that the fiscal benefit of migration since Brexit has become smaller because we've shifted quite strongly from EU migration to non-European countries. Studies into migration tend to find the annual net fiscal contribution was significantly higher amongst European countries. This study shows that a European migrant made a net contribution of 2,310 compared to a negative 840 for a non-European. Now, the effect is even bigger amongst Western European so-called older member states. So why does European immigration give more fiscal benefit? Well, workers are more likely to be graduate educated. Secondly, they tend to bring in fewer dependents, partly because it's much closer geographically. Non-European workers have a higher share of dependents and tend to stay a little bit longer. Nevertheless, if we take a dynamic approach to migration, which means we take into account how long they actually stay, this study found that even non-European workers had a net fiscal positive benefit of 28,000, although significantly less than the net fiscal benefit of a European. Now, the higher costs of non-European migration is something found quite dramatically in a 2015 study by the Danish government. They showed that non-EU migrants had a large negative impact on public finances. Now, this reflected two things. Firstly, the very generous Danish welfare state, and secondly, the fact that at the time, non-European migrants were only 25% coming for the primary purposes of work. Therefore, most of the non-European migrants had low employment levels and very weak attachment to the labour market. So it's not surprising that they had a net fiscal cost. Now, since 2015, Denmark has sought to limit welfare payments to first-generation migrants and also focus on improving the language skills of migrants and increasing the share of permits for the purpose of work. Now, coming back to the UK in 2024, the OBR suggests that a scenario of low migration would lead to a faster rise in net debt than a scenario of high migration. This is because of the age profile of migrants. Now, the dotted line assumes higher population leads to higher departmental spending to keep up with the growth in the population, something some models of migration do not always include. Now, this is significant because the outlook for UK spending in the long term is pretty grim. Because of an ageing population, projected spending is forecast to rise sharply because of all the health and pension spending. And at the same time, birth rates in the UK are also falling to really quite low levels. Now, some say, is immigration a solution to this ageing population? Now, certainly some countries like Japan and Korea have started to loosen their very strict immigration laws. But in the future, you may find really quite high competition for working age migrants, especially the skilled migrants which are in high demand. To some extent, migration can mitigate a falling population, but it would be a mistake to see it as a panacea. Also, another thing that's important is that when discussing the value of migration, it would be a mistake to only think in terms of net fiscal balance. For example, a hospital porter or care worker would be classed as a low-skilled, low-wage migrant worker, and if they stayed until they died, there'd be a net fiscal cost. But there's a much bigger picture going on as well. This is an area where the UK has a shortage of people due to native-born citizens just not wanting to do these low-paid jobs. One benefit of low-wage migration is that it enables native-born workers to take more attractive, higher-paid jobs. If we stop migration, we might need to spend more time looking after family members or employ more people in the care sector, meaning we have to take people away from other jobs. So it's really important to bear in mind that the social value of a care worker or hospital porter may not be adequately reflected in their actual wage or their net fiscal contribution. It's only a part of the picture. And studies do suggest that whilst a majority tend to want to reduce migration levels, a majority are also in favour of migrants working in the healthcare sector and social care sector. And in the past year, there's been a 157% rise in work permits for this sector because there is such a shortage in the UK. Now, net migration definitely increases GDP, with more people, more output. But what really counts is GDP per capita. And this is important for the UK because in the past 15 years, GDP has increased quite slowly, but GDP per capita is barely increasing at all. There's a big divergence. Now, evidence suggests that the impact on per capita income is rather muted. A Bank of England study found the impact of higher migration barely changed wages. However, there was a bigger negative impact for lower skilled workers who saw a 2% fall in real wages for a 10% rise in migration. Other studies suggest similar outcomes, with the biggest gainers being high-skilled workers and the biggest losers being those similar to migrant workers, those who are recent migrants themselves, low-skilled, poorly educated. Now, housing is a big issue in the whole Anglosphere. The rise in population, largely caused by net migration, has caused a large rise in demand for housing, a demand that hasn't really been met by increasing the housing stock. And as The Economist shows, demand for housing increasing faster than the ability to build houses and keep up. Now, when the population starts rising faster than the supply of housing, this puts upward pressure on house prices and rents in particular. Most migrants end up in the private rented sector they can't afford to buy. And it does go some way to explain the very rapid rise in rents that we've seen in the past 2 years during a period of high migration. And this is probably one of the biggest concerns about such a rapid increase in migration and population levels, because at the moment we're struggling to build enough houses, increase the amount of rented properties. Now, one of the main issues facing the UK economy is a stagnation in living standards. And this has many reasons why wages aren't going up. Now, in 2016, immigration to some extent was blamed, and this was a factor behind the Brexit vote. But the irony is that EU migrants were actually providing a small but significant fiscal benefit. But the change in migration policy since Brexit shifted the composition of migration, and if anything has led to a smaller net fiscal benefit. If you're interested in the impact of Brexit and why quite a lot of people regret it, this video on my global channel provides an interesting overview of the whole Brexit story.